The first gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, Montana Territory, 1878, as Mabel Rivers stepped off the stagecoach, her arrival marked by chaos rather than welcome. A dog howled, a child cried, and the townsfolk scattered like leaves in an autumn wind, not from the gunfire, which was common enough in these parts, but from the woman with copper hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. "It's her," whispered an elderly woman, crossing herself hastily. "The cursed one." Mabel pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, pretending not to hear the whispers that followed her like shadows. 24 years old and already branded by superstition, she'd grown accustomed to the sidelong glances, the mothers who hurried their children to the opposite side of the street. 3 towns in 2 years, and always the same story. Misfortune followed in her wake, or so they claimed. The truth was simpler and more painful. Mabel Rivers had survived what others hadn't, and for that crime, she wore an invisible scarlet letter. "Madam, your luggage." The stagecoach driver hesitated before setting her worn leather trunk at her feet, careful not to let his fingers brush against hers. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady. She'd learned to speak quietly, to move quietly, to exist quietly, as if by making herself small enough, she might slip past notice. The dusty main street of Redemption Creek stretched before her, a single meandering path lined with false-fronted buildings typical of frontier towns that had sprung up after the war. A general store, a saloon, a small church, and what appeared to be a newly constructed schoolhouse stood as monuments to civilization in the wilderness. It was the schoolhouse that had brought her here. The advertisement in the Eastern newspaper had promised a fresh start. Teacher wanted for growing community. Experience preferred. Inquire by post to mayor's office, Redemption Creek, Montana Territory. She had experience. Certainly, though, not the kind that would fit neatly in a letter of recommendation. As Mabel contemplated how to transport her trunk to the boarding house mentioned in the mayor's correspondence, a commotion erupted from the saloon across the street. 2 men burst through the swinging doors, locked in a violent struggle that spilled into the dusty road. "You cheatin' scoundrel," shouted one, a portly man with a bushy mustache stained yellow from tobacco. The other man, taller and leaner, deflected a wild punch with practiced ease. "I don't need to cheat to beat the likes of you, Peterson." The crowd that had scattered at Mabel's arrival now gathered to watch the fight, their earlier trepidation forgotten in the excitement. Mabel took a step back, clutching her reticule tighter. Violence had followed her enough. She had no desire to witness more. The taller man ended the fight with a single, efficient punch that sent his opponent sprawling in the dirt. As Peterson struggled to his feet, spitting blood and curses, the victor turned and his eyes met Mabel's across the street. For a moment, time seemed suspended. He was perhaps 30, with features weathered by sun and wind, and eyes the color of whiskey held to firelight. Unlike the others, he didn't look away when their gazes locked. Instead, something like curiosity flickered across his face. Mabel broke the connection first, bending to pick up her trunk. It was heavier than she remembered, and she struggled to lift it. "Allow me." The voice, deep and steady, startled her. The man from the fight stood before her, hat in hand, revealing dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. "That's not necessary," she said, her response automatic after years of calculated distance. "Maybe not, but it's the decent thing to do." He reached for the trunk and Mabel stepped back instinctively. His eyebrows rose slightly at her reaction, but he didn't comment. "Name's Garrett Xavier. Most folks just call me Zav. I'm Mabel Rivers," he finished for her. At her startled look, he added, "Small town, news travels fast." "You're the new schoolteacher," she nodded, suddenly aware of the eyes watching their interaction from doorways and windows. "Mr. Xavier, I appreciate the offer, but I don't want my help. I understand." He replaced his hat, studying her with those unsettling amber eyes. "But consider this, these good people are already talking. Might as well give them something worth gossiping about. Before she could protest further, he lifted her trunk effortlessly. "Boarding house is this way, Miss Rivers." Mrs. Haverson runs a tight ship, but she makes the best apple pie west of the Mississippi. Mabel hesitated, then fell into step beside him. "You seem well informed about a woman who just arrived in town." A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Like I said, small town. Mayor Thompson's been talking about the new schoolteacher for weeks. Said you came highly recommended from back east." She kept her expression neutral. The recommendation had come from a former employer who'd been eager to see her leave after the incident with the banker's son, the boy who'd fallen ill with fever the day after she'd refused his unwanted advances. The boy had recovered, but by then, the whispers had started. The curse, they called it. Bad luck followed those who crossed Mabel Rivers. "And what do you do in this small town, Mr. Xavier?" she asked, desperate to shift the conversation away from herself. "Bit of this, bit of that. I run some cattle north of town. Do some scouting for the army when they need it. Occasionally enforce the peace when Sheriff Donnelly's had too much to drink, which is most days." They reached the boarding house, a 2-story clapboard building with lace curtains visible through clean windows. Compared to some of the establishments she'd stayed in during her journey west, it looked positively luxurious. "Here we are," Garrett said, setting her trunk down on the porch. "Mrs. Haverson will get you settled." "Thank you," Mabel said, the words feeling insufficient. He tipped his hat, that same curious expression on his face. "Welcome to Redemption Creek, Miss Rivers. Hope you find what you're looking for here." As he turned to leave, the door opened to reveal a plump woman with silver-streaked blonde hair pulled into a tight bun. "Miss Rivers. We've been expecting you. Come in, come in." Mrs. Haverson ushered her inside, then paused to glance at Garrett's retreating form. "I see you've met our Mr. Xavier already." "Briefly," Mabel replied, noting the odd emphasis the woman placed on our. Mrs. Haverson's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Well, he's a decent sort for all his rough edges. Keeps to himself mostly, except when there's trouble." She bustled Mabel inside, continuing her chatter as they climbed the stairs to a small but clean room at the back of the house. "Mayor Thompson will want to see you tomorrow, first thing. School term starts in a week, so you'll have time to prepare. The previous teacher left rather suddenly, family emergency back east, you understand." Mabel nodded, though she suspected there was more to the story. "Supper's at 6 sharp. We keep regular hours here." Mrs. Haverson paused at the door. "Oh, and Miss Rivers, you might hear some talk around town. People can be superstitious in these parts. Best to keep to yourself until they get to know you proper." With that cryptic warning, the landlady departed, leaving Mabel alone in the unfamiliar room. She moved to the window, gazing out at the town that would be her home for how long, she couldn't say. Her gaze drifted to the street below, where Garrett Xavier stood in conversation with a man in a suit who could only be Mayor Thompson. As if sensing her observation, Garrett glanced up, meeting her eyes through the glass. This time, Mabel didn't look away. The school bell rang sharply at 8 o'clock, its clean, bright tone at odds with the dilapidated building it summoned students to. Mabel stood in the doorway, watching as children approached with varying degrees of reluctance. It had been 3 days since her arrival, and already the whispers had circulated. "The new teacher is cursed. Don't look her in the eye. Don't let her touch you." She'd hoped foolishly, perhaps, that the frontier would be different, that people here would be too practical for such superstitions. She'd been wrong. "Good morning," she called as the first students approached, her smile firmly in place despite the way some of them shrank back. A girl of about 10 with braided blonde hair and a determined expression was the first to step forward. "Morning, Miss Rivers. I'm Sarah Peterson." Peterson? The name of the man who'd fought with Garrett Xavier her first day in town. The girl showed none of her father's belligerence, however, meeting Mabel's gaze directly. "Welcome, Sarah. Please take a seat inside." More children arrived, some alone, others in small groups or with parents who regarded Mabel with barely concealed suspicion. By the time the bell finished ringing, 14 students of various ages were seated at the scarred wooden desks. "Good morning, class," Mabel began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I'm Miss Rivers, and I'll be your teacher this term." A boy in the back row, perhaps 13, whispered something to his neighbor that made the other boy snicker. Mabel pretended not to notice. "We'll begin with mathematics for the younger students, while the older ones will work on their composition skills." She turned to write on the blackboard, feeling the weight of their stares on her back. "My pa says you bring bad luck," announced a small voice from the middle of the room. Mabel turned slowly. A boy of about 7 looked up at her with solemn eyes. "Richard?" Sarah Peterson hissed, looking mortified. "It's all right," Mabel said, addressing the class as a whole. "I'm sure you've all heard stories, but I assure you I'm just here to teach." "My ma says you killed a man back east," another student added, this one a girl of perhaps 12 with suspicious eyes. Mabel felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crack. "That's not true. I've never harmed anyone." The whispers grew, like a rising tide threatening to drown her. She'd faced this before, but never so quickly, never so openly. "That's enough." The voice from the doorway silenced the room instantly. Garrett Xavier stood there, hat in hand, his expression unreadable. "You children ought to be ashamed, repeating gossip like that." "Mr. Xavier," Mabel acknowledged, struggling to keep the surprise from her voice. "Is there something I can help you with?" He stepped into the schoolhouse, his presence filling the small space. The children watched him with a mixture of fascination and wariness. "Mayor Thompson asked me to drop off these books for the school library, came on yesterday's stage." He set a small crate on her desk, then turned to address the class. "Miss Rivers came all the way from back east to teach you youngsters. Might show some respect." The children shifted uncomfortably in their seats. All except the outspoken Richard, who piped up, "But Mr. Xavier, they say she's cursed." Garrett crouched down to the boy's eye level. "People say a lot of things, Richard. They used to say the world was flat, too." He stood, addressing the whole class again. "Judge people by what they do, not what others say about them. That's a lesson worth learning." With that, he tipped his hat to Mabel and turned to leave. "Thank you, Mr. Xavier," she said, finding her voice at last. He paused at the door, glancing back. "Just Garrett, please." For the first time, she saw a genuine smile warm his features. "Or Zav, if you prefer." After he left, the classroom remained subdued. Sarah Peterson raised her hand tentatively. "Miss Rivers, may I help distribute the arithmetic slates?" Mabel nodded, grateful for the girl's initiative. "Thank you, Sarah." The day proceeded more smoothly after that, though Mabel remained acutely aware of the whispers and sidelong glances. By the time she dismissed the class at 3 o'clock, she felt drained, as if she'd run miles rather than stood at a blackboard. She was gathering her materials when a shadow fell across her desk. Sarah Peterson stood there, clutching her slate to her chest. "Miss Rivers." "I don't think you're cursed," the girl said quietly. "My pa says foolish things when he's been drinking." Mabel felt a surge of gratitude for the child's unexpected kindness. "Thank you, Sarah. That means a great deal to me." "Mr. Xavier doesn't think you're cursed either," Sarah continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I heard him tell my pa off for spreading rumors about you at the saloon last night." Before Mabel could respond, a woman's voice called from outside. "Sarah, come along now." "That's my ma, I have to go." Sarah hurried toward the door, then paused. "See you tomorrow, Miss Rivers." Left alone in the quiet classroom, Mabel sat heavily in her chair. Garrett Xavier had defended her twice now. It was a novel experience, having someone stand up for her rather than standing aside as suspicion mounted. As she locked the schoolhouse and started the short walk back to Mrs. Havorson's boarding house, Mabel found herself wondering about the enigmatic cattleman. His kindness was puzzling in a town already predisposed to believe the worst of her. She was so lost in thought that she nearly collided with Mayor Thompson outside the general store. "Ah, Miss Rivers, just the person I wanted to see." The mayor was a portly man with mutton chop whiskers and an air of perpetual satisfaction. "How was your first day with our young scholars?" Educational for all of us, I think, Mabel replied diplomatically. Mayor Thompson chuckled. Yes, well, children will be children. I trust they'll settle down once the novelty wears off. He cleared his throat. I wanted to invite you to the town social this Saturday, held at the church, very respectable. Good opportunity for you to meet the parents and other townsfolk in a more favorable setting. The hesitation in his voice told Mabel everything she needed to know. The rumors had reached him too. That's very kind, Mayor, but I wouldn't want to cause any discomfort. Nonsense, he interrupted. You're our schoolteacher. Your presence is expected. His tone left no room for refusal. Then I would be delighted, she said, knowing she had little choice. Excellent, 7 o'clock Saturday evening. He tipped his hat and continued on his way, leaving Mabel with a sense of foreboding, the town social, where everyone would be watching her, waiting for something to go wrong. Waiting for proof of the curse. She continued toward the boarding house, her steps heavy with resignation. As she rounded the corner, she spotted a familiar figure leaning against the hitching post outside Mrs. Havorson's establishment. Garrett straightened as she approached. Miss Rivers. Mr. Xavier, she acknowledged, then corrected herself. Garrett, he smiled at her use of his given name. Thought you might like to know Sarah Peterson came by the ranch after school, asked me to teach her to ride. Said a certain schoolteacher had mentioned how horses were crucial to the development of the West. Mabel blinked in surprise. She had indeed discussed transportation during their history lesson, but she hadn't expected any of the children to take such an interest. That's wonderful, she said finally. She also mentioned that Richard Miller apologized to you before leaving. His expression grew serious. Things might be changing already, or they might not, Mabel replied, unable to suppress her pessimism. The town social is Saturday. Understanding dawned in his eyes. Ah, the gauntlet, precisely, he considered her for a moment. I don't usually attend those affairs, find them tedious to be honest, but I might make an exception this time. The implication was clear. He was offering his support, a buffer against the town's suspicion. That's not necessary, Mabel said automatically, though part of her longed to accept. Probably not, he agreed easily. But I find myself curious about what a schoolteacher from back east might wear to a frontier social. Despite herself, Mabel smiled. Nothing that would pass muster in Boston society, I'm afraid. Good, Boston society sounds dull as dishwater. He pushed away from the hitching post. Saturday then, 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock, she confirmed, wondering if she was making a terrible mistake. As he walked away, Mrs. Havorson opened the front door, her expression a mixture of surprise and disapproval. Was that Garrett Xavier I saw you talking with? Yes, Mabel replied simply, mounting the porch steps. He was kind enough to check on how my first day of teaching went. The landlady's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. Was he indeed? How unexpected. She held the door open, adding in a lower voice, You might want to be careful there, Miss Rivers. Garrett Xavier has his own reputation in this town. Oh, Mabel couldn't help her curiosity. Mrs. Havorson glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers before continuing. He came here 5 years ago during that terrible winter. No one knows much about his past except that he fought for the Union in the war. Keeps to himself mostly, except when there's trouble, then he's always somehow in the middle of it. He seems decent enough to me, Mabel ventured. Oh, he's decent, Mrs. Havorson agreed readily. Too decent sometimes, standing up for those no one else will. She gave Mabel a significant look. Like our last schoolteacher. Mabel felt a chill. What happened to her, really, Mrs. Havorson sighed. Miss Jenkins was progressive in her thinking. Started teaching the girls advanced mathematics, saying they should be prepared for more than just marriage and motherhood. Some folks didn't take kindly to that. There was talk, then threats. Xavier stood up for her, but she shook her head. Family emergency back east was a kinder explanation than the truth. Which was, she left in the middle of the night, terrified for her safety. Mrs. Havorson patted Mabel's arm, but don't you worry, things will be different for you, I'm sure. As Mabel climbed the stairs to her room, she wasn't so certain. One thing was clear, however, there was more to Garrett Xavier than met the eye. And perhaps, just perhaps, she'd found an unexpected ally in this hostile town. Saturday evening arrived with alarming swiftness. Mabel stood before the small mirror in her room, assessing her appearance with a critical eye. Her best dress, a modest navy blue affair with white lace at the collar and cuffs, looked woefully inadequate for the occasion. In the 4 days since school had begun, the whispers had only intensified. Yesterday, a mother had withdrawn her child from the school, claiming the boy had developed a mysterious cough after Mabel had corrected his spelling. The incident had spread through town like wildfire, adding fuel to the suspicions already surrounding her. A knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. "Miss Rivers," Mrs. Haverson called. "There's someone here to see you." Puzzled, Mabel opened the door to find her landlady wearing an expression of bemused disapproval. "Mr. Xavier is waiting in the parlor. Says he's escorting you to the social." She lowered her voice. "I tried to tell him it wasn't proper, you not being formally introduced and all, but he can be quite persistent." Mabel felt a flutter of something that might have been anxiety or anticipation or both. "Thank you, Mrs. Haverson. I'll be down directly." The landlady nodded, clearly burning with curiosity but too well bred to pry further. When Mabel descended the stairs a few minutes later, she found Garrett standing by the parlor window, his back to her. He'd exchanged his usual attire for a black suit that, while not new, was well maintained. His dark hair was neatly combed, the silver at his temples catching the lamplight. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and for a moment, something like appreciation flickered in his eyes before his expression settled into its usual inscrutability. "Miss Rivers," he said, inclining his head, "you look lovely." "Thank you," she replied, suddenly conscious of her plain dress and simple hairstyle. "Though I fear I'm underdressed for the occasion." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Trust me, you'll outshine every woman there." Mrs. Haverson cleared her throat meaningfully from the doorway. "The social starts at 7 and it's nearly that now. Best be on your way." Outside, Mabel was surprised to find not horses but a small buggy waiting. Garrett helped her up, his hand warm and steady on hers. "I thought we might arrive in style," he explained, climbing up beside her. "Make a proper entrance." "Is that wise?" Mabel asked as they set off toward the church. "Won't it only fuel the gossip?" He glanced at her, amusement dancing in his amber eyes. "Precisely, if they're going to talk anyway, might as well give them something worth talking about." Despite her nervousness, Mabel found herself smiling. "You're a troublemaker, Mr. Xavier." "So I've been told," he agreed cheerfully. "But in my experience, people who worry about appearances often have far more to hide than those who don't." They rode in companionable silence for a few minutes, the clip-clop of the horses' hooves a steady rhythm in the gathering dusk. "May I ask you something?" Mabel ventured finally. "Anything. Why are you doing this, standing up for me when everyone else seems determined to believe the worst?" Garrett was quiet for so long that Mabel thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "After the war, I came west because I couldn't stand the way people looked at me back home like I was some kind of hero or monster, depending on their politics. All I wanted was to be judged for who I was, not what others thought I was." He glanced at her. "Seems to me you deserve the same courtesy." Before Mabel could respond, they arrived at the church. Light spilled from its windows, and the sounds of conversation and laughter drifted into the night. Several people milled about outside, their chatter dying away as the buggy approached. "Ready?" Garrett asked softly. Mabel took a deep breath, straightening her shoulders. "As I'll ever be." He jumped down and came around to help her descend, his hand lingering on hers perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. Together, they walked toward the church entrance, where Mayor Thompson stood greeting arrivals. "Miss Rivers and Mr. Xavier, what a surprise." The mayor's smile faltered slightly as he took in their joint arrival. "Don't believe I've seen you at one of these gatherings before, Xavier." Thought it was time I participated more in community affairs, Garrett replied blandly. Miss Rivers kindly agreed to accompany me. The mayor's eyebrows rose, but he recovered quickly. Well, how wonderful. Please, both of you, come in. There's punch and refreshments inside. As they entered, conversation dimmed noticeably. Mabel felt the weight of dozens of stares, some curious, others openly hostile. She resisted the urge to shrink back, instead standing taller. Chin up, Garrett murmured, so only she could hear. You faced down 14 unruly children this week. This lot can't be any worse. His words bolstered her courage. I wouldn't be so sure, she whispered back and was rewarded with a quiet chuckle. They made their way to the refreshment table where Sarah Peterson was serving punch under her mother's supervision. The girl's face lit up at the sight of them. Miss Rivers, Mr. Xavier, she exclaimed. Would you like some punch? I helped make it. We'd be delighted, Mabel replied, touched by the child's enthusiasm. Mrs. Peterson, a thin woman with the same blonde hair as her daughter, looked distinctly uncomfortable. Sarah, perhaps you should let me serve Mr. Xavier and the teacher. Garrett accepted a cup from Sarah with a wink that made the girl beam. Excellent punch, Miss Peterson. You have a real talent. The simple praise made Sarah stand straighter, pride evident in her young face. Thank you, sir. Miss Rivers has been teaching us about measurements in mathematics. I used what I learned to get the recipe just right. Mrs. Peterson's expression softened slightly at this evidence of her daughter's education. Has she indeed? Well, that's practical, I suppose. It was a small opening, but Mabel seized it. Sarah has a natural aptitude for mathematics. With the right encouragement, she could excel in many practical areas. Before Mrs. Peterson could respond, a loud voice cut through the general conversation. Well, if it ain't the cursed schoolmarm and her champion. The speaker was Peterson himself, clearly already in his cups despite the early hour and the supposedly respectable setting. He swayed slightly as he approached them, his expression belligerent. Peterson, Garrett acknowledged coolly. Didn't expect to see you at a church social. Wouldn't have come if I'd known she'd be here, Peterson jabbed a finger toward Mabel. Bad enough my girl has to sit in her classroom all day, now she's poisoning our social too. Mrs. Peterson placed a protective hand on Sarah's shoulder. Thomas, please, not here. But Peterson was beyond listening. You know what they say about her back east, that she killed a man with just a look, that livestock die when she passes, that's enough. Garrett's voice was quiet but carried an unmistakable edge of steel. You're frightening your daughter and embarrassing yourself, Peterson sneered. Defending her again, Xavier. What's she giving you that's worth risking the curse? A collective gasp went up from those near enough to hear. Mabel felt her cheeks burn with humiliation and anger. Mr. Peterson, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I understand your concerns, but I assure you there is no curse. I'm simply a teacher trying to do my job. Liar, he spat. Things been going wrong ever since you got here. Miller boy getting sick, Johnson's cow dying. Rain holding off when we need it. All normal occurrences, Mayor Thompson interjected, having hurried over at the first sign of disturbance. Thomas, perhaps you should get some fresh air. Not until she admits what she is, Peterson insisted, his voice rising. Admit you're cursed, woman. The room had gone silent, all pretense of normal social interaction abandoned as the confrontation escalated. Mabel stood frozen, aware that her response now would define her place in this community. I am not cursed, she said clearly, meeting Peterson's bloodshot eyes. I am a woman who has suffered losses and faced prejudice because people fear what they don't understand. If seeking education and independence makes me cursed in your eyes, then so be it. But I will not apologize for who I am. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some looked thoughtful, others more suspicious than ever. Peterson's face darkened with rage. You'll bring ruin to this town, he growled. Just like you did to the last place and the one before that. Wherever you go, misfortune follows, everyone knows it. And yet here I stand, Garrett said, stepping slightly in front of Mabel. I've spent more time with Miss Rivers than anyone else in this town, and I seem to be in perfect health. For now, Peterson retorted, but mark my words, Xavier, your luck will turn sour too. They all get hurt, those who get close to her. Then let me be cursed too. Garrett's voice rang out, clear and resolute. Because I choose her, curse and all. The declaration hung in the air, stunning Peterson into momentary silence. Mabel stared at Garrett, her heart pounding with an emotion she couldn't name. You're a fool, Peterson said finally, but with less conviction. Maybe so, Garrett agreed easily, but I'd rather be a fool who thinks for himself than a wise man who lets fear rule his life. He turned to Mabel, offering his arm. I believe I promised you a dance, Miss Rivers. There was no music playing yet, no dancing had begun, but Mabel understood what he was doing, offering her a graceful exit from the confrontation. She placed her hand on his arm, feeling the solid strength beneath the fabric of his suit. Yes, I believe you did, she replied, matching his calm tone. As they moved away from Peterson and the uncomfortable cluster of onlookers, Mabel whispered, There's no music. A minor detail, Garrett replied, leading her toward the far end of the room where several musicians were setting up their instruments. He spoke briefly to them, and moments later the strains of a waltz filled the church hall. May I have this dance? He asked formally, holding out his hand. Mabel hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. You may. As he led her into the dance, other couples gradually joined them on the makeshift dance floor, the tension from Peterson's outburst slowly dissipating. Garrett moved with surprising grace for a man who spent his days on horseback, guiding Mabel through the steps with gentle confidence. Thank you, she said softly, for what you said back there. His eyes met hers, serious now. I meant it, every word. You hardly know me, she pointed out. I know enough. His hand tightened slightly at her waist. I know you face each day with courage despite the whispers. I know you treat every child in your classroom with respect, even those whose parents shun you. I know you have nightmares. Mrs. Havorson mentioned you cry out in your sleep sometimes. Mabel missed a step in surprise, but he smoothly compensated. That's rather personal information. This is a small town, he reminded her. And Mrs. Havorson worries about you for all her pretense of proper distance. They danced in silence for a few moments, Mabel struggling to process his words. He meant what he'd said, that he chose her, curse and all. No one had ever chosen her side so openly, so defiantly. People will talk, she said finally, a smile tugged at his lips. People already talk, might as well give them something interesting to discuss. You're risking a great deal. Your reputation, your standing in the community, my reputation is already questionable at best, he interrupted gently. And as for the community, he glanced around at the other dancers, at the townsfolk watching from the sidelines. Look around, Mabel, not everyone shares Peterson's view. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the intimacy of it sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with fear. Following his gaze, she realized he was right. While some faces still showed suspicion or outright hostility, others more than she would have expected reflected curiosity, sympathy, or simple indifference. The music ended, and they came to a stop, still holding each other. For a moment, the noise and movement of the social faded away, and it was just the two of them, connected by touch and shared defiance. Then reality intruded in the form of Mayor Thompson, who approached with a forced smile. Miss Rivers, Mr. Xavier, quite a lovely dance. He lowered his voice. Perhaps it would be best if you both stepped outside for some air. Peterson is still rather agitated. Garrett's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Of course, Mayor, we wouldn't want to disrupt your social any further. As they made their way toward the door, several people stepped aside, avoiding eye contact. But Sarah Peterson darted forward, tugging at Mabel's hand. Miss Rivers, she whispered urgently. Don't let my pa scare you away. He's wrong about you. I know he is. Mabel squeezed the girl's hand. I'm not going anywhere, Sarah. I'll see you in class on Monday. Outside, the night air was cool and refreshing after the stuffy confines of the crowded church. Stars spread across the vast Montana sky like diamonds scattered on black velvet, more brilliant than Mabel had ever seen in the city-lit skies of the east. "I'm sorry," Garrett said as they walked toward his waiting buggy. "I thought my presence might help, not make things worse." "You have nothing to apologize for," Mabel replied firmly. "You stood up for me when no one else would. That means more than I can express." He helped her into the buggy, then climbed up beside her. Instead of immediately taking the reins, however, he turned to face her. "Mabel," he said, her name soft on his lips, "there's something you should know about me." "What is it?" she asked, suddenly apprehensive. "I have my own ghosts, my own curse, if you will." His expression was solemn in the moonlight. "I came west after the war because there was nothing left for me back home. My family was gone, my friends scattered or dead. I did things during the fighting that haunt me still." Mabel listened silently, sensing his need to speak. "People here know I fought for the Union, but they don't know I was a sharpshooter." His voice grew distant. "I was good at killing from a distance, too good. After a while, I stopped seeing men and started seeing targets." He looked down at his hands. "These hands have more blood on them than anyone in this town could imagine." "The war asked terrible things of men on both sides," Mabel said gently. "You were a soldier doing what soldiers must." He shook his head. "It's not that simple. After the war, I couldn't adjust. I drifted, took jobs that needed a gun, became the very thing I'd fought against, a man who solved problems with violence." His eyes met hers, haunted yet determined. "So you see, if anyone in this town is cursed, it's me, not you." Mabel considered his words carefully. "Is that why you defended me?" "Because you see yourself as somehow deserving of whatever misfortune might follow." A rueful smile touched his lips. "Maybe at first, but now." He hesitated. "Now I defend you because I see someone fighting the same battle I've fought, trying to outrun a past that follows like a shadow." Without thinking, Mabel reached out to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his weather-roughened cheek. "Then perhaps we're well matched, Mr. Xavier." For a moment he leaned into her touch, his eyes closing briefly. Then he straightened, taking up the reins. "We should get you back to Mrs. Havorson's before she sends out a search party." As they drove through the quiet streets of Redemption Creek, Mabel felt a curious lightness despite the disastrous ending to the social. For the first time in years, she had spoken her truth aloud and found someone who didn't turn away in fear or disgust. More than that, she had found someone who understood. Whatever curse the town believed in, hers or his seemed less powerful in the shared space between them. The following weeks brought subtle changes to Mabel's position in Redemption Creek. While some families continued to regard her with suspicion, others began to warm, particularly as their children brought home evidence of actual learning rather than mysterious ailments. Peterson had withdrawn Sarah from the school after the social, but the girl appeared at Mabel's classroom door 3 days later, escorted by her mother rather than her father. "She's been crying herself to sleep," Mrs. Peterson had explained stiffly. "Says she's missing important lessons." A hesitation then. "My husband doesn't know. He's away on business in Helena for a fortnight." Mabel had welcomed Sarah back without comment on the secrecy, understanding the delicate position Mrs. Peterson occupied. As for Garrett, he had become a regular visitor to the schoolhouse, often arriving at the end of the day with some transparent excuse books to donate, a loose shutter to fix, news from the town council. The children grew accustomed to his presence, especially the boys, who clustered around him with questions about horses, cattle, and occasionally, to Mabel's dismay, guns. "Have you ever shot a man, Mr. Xavier?" young Richard Miller asked one afternoon as they were leaving the schoolhouse. Garrett's expression didn't change, but Mabel saw the shadow that passed behind his eyes. "Yes," he answered simply. "And it's not something to ask about lightly, Richard. Taking a life changes you even when it's necessary." The boy had sobered at that, nodding with newfound respect. "Yes, sir." "I understand." Such moments revealed to Mabel the depth of the man beneath the calm exterior, his capacity for honesty, even when truth was difficult. his willingness to engage children as thinking beings rather than nuisances to be dismissed. It was nearly a month after the social when disaster struck. Mabel was halfway through the morning lessons when Sarah Peterson burst into the classroom, her face streaked with tears. "Miss Rivers, come quick, it's the mill. There's been an accident, pa's trapped." Mabel didn't hesitate. Class dismissed. Older students see the younger ones safely home. She grabbed her shawl and followed Sarah at a run toward the sawmill at the edge of town. A crowd had already gathered, the air thick with shouts and the acrid smell of smoke. A section of the mill's roof had collapsed, and through the gap, Mabel could see flames beginning to lick at the wooden beams inside. Thomas was inspecting a new shipment of lumber when it happened, Mrs. Peterson explained, clutching Mabel's arm with desperate strength. "They say he's pinned under a beam and the fire's spreading." Sheriff Donnelly was attempting to organize a rescue party, but the heat and smoke were driving back even the most determined volunteers. "It's too dangerous," he shouted as two men tried to push past him. "That roof's going to come down any minute." "Where's Garrett?" Mabel asked, scanning the crowd. "Has anyone seen Mr. Xavier?" "Up at his ranch, last I heard," someone replied. "Sent word, but it'll be a while before he gets here." Mabel looked at the burning mill, at Sarah's tear-stained face, at Mrs. Peterson's desperate eyes. Peterson had been cruel to her, had spread vicious rumors, had tried to turn the town against her. But he was Sarah's father, a man with a family who needed him. Without allowing herself time to reconsider, Mabel pushed through the crowd toward the mill entrance. "Miss Rivers?" Sheriff Donnelly moved to block her path. "You can't go in there." "I'm smaller and lighter than most of your volunteers," she replied steadily. "I might be able to reach him where others can't." "It's suicide," the sheriff insisted. "It's the right thing to do." She met his gaze unflinchingly. "Now, where exactly is he trapped?" Perhaps it was the authority in her voice, so similar to the tone she used with unruly students, or perhaps it was simple desperation. But the sheriff relented, quickly describing Peterson's last known location. Mabel tied her damp handkerchief over her nose and mouth and entered the burning building. Heat assaulted her immediately, along with thick smoke that made her eyes water and her lungs protest. She crouched low, following the sheriff's directions toward the far corner of the mill floor. "Peterson." She called, her voice muffled by the handkerchief and the growing roar of the flames. "Can you hear me?" A weak cough answered her, followed by a strained voice. "Here, over here." Following the sound, she found him pinned beneath a heavy wooden beam, his face gray with pain and smoke inhalation. When he recognized her, his bloodshot eyes widened in disbelief. "You, try not to talk," she instructed, assessing the situation. The beam was too heavy for her to lift alone, but she noticed it was balanced precariously on a pile of lumber. If she could dislodge some of the wood beneath one end, it might shift enough for Peterson to pull free. "I'm going to try to move this beam," she explained, already working to pull away pieces of lumber. "When I tell you, push with all your strength." Peterson nodded weakly, comprehension dawning through his pain. "Why?" he rasped. "Why help me, after everything?" Mabel paused, meeting his gaze directly. "Because this is who I am, Mr. Peterson, not what you or anyone else believes me to be." A crash from behind her signaled another portion of the roof giving way. There was no more time for talk. Mabel positioned herself at the end of the beam and threw her weight against the supporting lumber. "Now," she shouted as the beam began to shift. Peterson strained, his face contorted with effort. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of splintering wood, the beam moved just enough for him to drag himself free. He collapsed immediately, coughing violently. Mabel knelt beside him, assessing his injuries. His leg was clearly broken, and burns marked his arms where embers had fallen. "Can you move at all?" she asked, conscious of the rapidly deteriorating conditions around them. "Not without help," he managed between coughs. Mabel looked at the distance to the door, the thickening smoke, the spreading flames. There was no way she could carry him out alone. They were trapped. "Help," she shouted, knowing it was likely futile. The roar of the fire would drown out her voice to those outside. "We need help." As if in answer, a dark figure appeared through the smoke, moving with purpose. "Garrett." Mabel's relief was overwhelming. "Saw the smoke from the ridge," he explained tersely, crouching beside them. He took in Peterson's condition with a quick glance. "Legs broken, we'll have to carry him." Together, they managed to get Peterson upright, supporting him between them. Progress was agonizingly slow, each step a battle against pain, smoke, and the increasing instability of the structure around them. They were perhaps halfway to the exit when a terrible groaning sound came from above. Mabel looked up to see a section of the roof directly over them beginning to give way. "Run!" Garrett shouted, shoving them forward with surprising strength. They stumbled toward the door as the roof collapsed behind them, sending a wave of heat and debris in their direction. Mabel felt something strike her shoulder, a searing pain that nearly caused her to lose her grip on Peterson. But somehow they kept moving, one excruciating step after another, until suddenly they were outside, gulping clean air as willing hands pulled them to safety. The crowd's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Cheers erupted as they emerged, people rushing forward to help Peterson, to pat Garrett on the back, to express amazement and relief. Through the chaos, Mabel became aware of Mrs. Peterson standing before her, tears streaming down her face. Without warning, the woman embraced her tightly. "You saved him," she whispered. "After everything he said about you, you went in there and saved him." Before Mabel could respond, she felt a small pair of arms wrap around her waist. Sarah looked up at her with shining eyes. "I knew you weren't cursed, Miss Rivers, I knew it." The doctor arrived to tend to Peterson, and Garrett appeared at Mabel's side, his face streaked with soot but his eyes bright with something that might have been pride. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen," he said quietly. "Going in there alone." "I wasn't alone for long," she replied, wincing as the pain in her shoulder made itself known again. His expression changed to concern. "You're hurt." "It's nothing, let me be the judge of that." With gentle hands, he examined the burn on her shoulder, his touch careful yet sure. "You'll need this cleaned and bandaged properly. Come on, the doctor will see to it after he's stabilized Peterson." As they made their way toward the doctor's makeshift treatment area, Mabel became aware of a subtle shift in the atmosphere. People who had previously avoided her gaze now nodded respectfully. A few reached out to touch her arm or shoulder in passing, murmuring thanks or praise. "Looks like you've broken your own curse," Garrett observed, noticing the change as well. Mabel shook her head. "There was never any curse to break, only fear and misunderstanding. And a woman brave enough to face both," he added softly. Later, after the doctor had treated her burn and declared Peterson would recover with time and rest, Mabel found herself sitting on the steps of the schoolhouse, watching as the last of the mill fire was extinguished. The evening air was cool against her skin, a blessed relief after the inferno. Footsteps approached, and she looked up to see Garrett standing before her, cleaned up now, his damp hair slicked back from his forehead. "May I join you?" he asked. She nodded, shifting to make room beside her on the step. They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching the activity around the smoldering remains of the mill. "Peterson asked to see you," Garrett said finally, "when you're feeling up to it." Mabel raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Did he say why?" "I believe he has something he wants to tell you himself." A small smile played at the corner of his mouth. "Though I can guess." Another silence fell between them, comfortable yet charged with unspoken thoughts. "You know," Garrett said eventually, "when I said I chose you, curse and all, at the social, I meant it. But not just in the way everyone assumed." Mabel turned to look at him, her heart suddenly beating faster. "What did you mean then?" He met her gaze directly, his amber eyes reflecting the dying light. "I meant that I choose you, Mabel Rivers. Not just to defend or stand beside as a friend, though I'm honored to do both. I choose you as a man chooses the woman he wants to build a life with if she'll have him." The directness of his declaration took her breath away. "Garrett, you don't need to answer now," he interrupted gently. I know it's sudden. I know we've known each other only a short time, but today, watching you risk your life for a man who'd done nothing but harm you. I realized I couldn't wait any longer to tell you how I feel." Mabel looked down at her hands, calloused from work yet still bearing the refined shape of her Eastern upbringing. Hands that had turned pages for eager students, that had pulled a man from burning rubble, that now trembled slightly at this unexpected turn. "I came west to escape," she said slowly. "To find a place where I could be judged for who I am, not for the superstitions that followed me. I never expected to find this, he prompted when she fell silent. She looked up at him, allowing herself to hope for the first time in years. "A home, acceptance, and you." Garrett reached out, his hand covering hers, warm and steady. "And do you choose it? Do you choose me, curse and all?" A smile spread across Mabel's face, genuine and unguarded. "I do. I choose you, Garrett Xavier, exactly as you are." He leaned forward then, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey. Around them, the town of Redemption Creek continued its evening activities, people walking home from the mill site, lamps being lit in windows, the distant sound of a piano from the saloon. But for Mabel, the world had narrowed to this moment, this man, this choice. When they finally broke apart, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "They'll still talk, you know. Some folks don't change their minds easily." "Let them talk," Mabel replied, her voice stronger than it had ever been. "We know the truth." Peterson's recovery was slow but steady. True to Garrett's word, he had asked to see Mabel, and when she visited him at his home a few days after the fire, he had struggled to find the right words before finally saying simply, "I was wrong about you. I'm sorry." It wasn't eloquent, but it was sincere, and Mabel accepted it as such. Sarah, overjoyed to have both her father's recovery and her teacher's vindication, threw herself into her studies with renewed enthusiasm, often staying after school to help Mabel prepare lessons for the following day. As for the town itself, opinions shifted like sand in a desert wind. Some, like Mayor Thompson, wholeheartedly embraced the new narrative of the heroic schoolteacher. Others remained wary but kept their suspicions to themselves. A few, including Mrs. Havorson, claimed they had known all along that Miss Rivers was a good sort. And through it all, Garrett remained steadfast at Mabel's side. He continued to run his cattle ranch, but now he made time to visit the school regularly, sometimes bringing calves or foals for the children to see as part of their natural science lessons. In the evenings, he and Mabel would often sit on the porch of Mrs. Havorson's boarding house under the landlady's watchful eye, of course, planning a future that once would have seemed impossible. 3 months after the mill fire, on a crisp autumn day with leaves turning gold in the mountains, Mabel stood before her classroom, watching as her students filed in for the morning session. Sarah Peterson arrived early as usual, but today she carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. "This is for you, Miss Rivers," she said, presenting it with a shy smile. "Pa helped me pick it out." Curious, Mabel unwrapped the gift to find a small silver brooch in the shape of a book. "It's beautiful, Sarah, thank you." "Pa says it's to remind you that you're writing a new story here," Sarah explained. "One without any curses in it." Touched, Mabel pinned the brooch to her dress. "That's very thoughtful. Please thank your father for me." As the rest of the students arrived, Mabel noticed an unusual level of excitement among them. Whispers and giggles filled the room, along with knowing glances in her direction. "Settle down, everyone," she called, bringing the class to order. "We have a lot to cover today." Before she could begin the lesson, however, the classroom door opened to reveal Garrett, dressed in his Sunday best, hat in hand. The children immediately erupted in barely suppressed giggles. "Mr. Xavier," Mabel acknowledged, her cheeks warming at his unexpected appearance. "Is there something I can help you with?" He stepped into the room, glancing around at the eager faces of the students before focusing on her. "I apologize for interrupting your class, Miss Rivers, but I have a question that can't wait any longer." A hush fell over the room as Garrett crossed to where she stood. With grace that belied his rugged appearance, he knelt before her, taking her hand in his. "Mabel Rivers," he said, his voice clear and sure, "from the moment you stepped off that stagecoach, you've brought nothing but light and courage to this town and to my life. They called you cursed, but you showed all of us what true strength looks like." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band. "I meant what I said that night. I choose you now and always. Will you marry me?" The classroom erupted in cheers before Mabel could even respond, the children abandoning all pretense of decorum. Through tears of joy, she nodded. "Yes," she said, loud enough to be heard over the commotion. "Yes, I will marry you, Garrett Xavier." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and kissed her, heedless of their audience. The children's cheers grew even louder, some of the girls sighing romantically while the boys made exaggerated gagging noises that couldn't quite hide their grins. When they broke apart, Garrett turned to address the class. "I hope you'll all forgive me for stealing your teacher away for the afternoon. Mayor Thompson has agreed to serve as a substitute." On cue, the mayor entered, looking both amused and slightly overwhelmed at the prospect of managing 20 energetic children. "Congratulations to you both," he said, shaking Garrett's hand and kissing Mabel's cheek. "Now off with you. I believe Mrs. Havorson has prepared a special luncheon in your honor." Hand in hand, they left the schoolhouse to find much of the town gathered outside. Someone had hung a banner between two trees that read, "Congratulations," and Mrs. Peterson stood ready with a basket of flower petals, which Sarah eagerly helped to scatter in their path. "Did everyone know about this except me?" Mabel asked, laughing as they made their way through the crowd of well-wishers. "Pretty much," Garrett admitted with a grin. "It's hard to keep secrets in a town this size, especially when you need as many conspirators as I did to pull this off." At Mrs. Havorson's boarding house, tables had been set up in the garden, laden with food and decorated with autumn flowers. The entire town, it seemed, had contributed to the celebration, from the Petersons' contribution of a roast pig to the bakery's elaborate cake, from the general store owner's donation of fine wine to the colorful quilts that the sewing circle had secretly been working on as wedding gifts. As they moved among their friends and neighbors, for that was what they truly were now, Mabel marveled at the transformation. Less than 6 months ago, she had arrived in Redemption Creek as a stranger, feared and mistrusted. Now she stood accepted, respected, and loved, not just by the man at her side, but by a community that had learned to see beyond superstition and rumor. "Happy?" Garrett asked softly, his arm around her waist as they took a moment alone beneath the shade of an old oak tree. Mabel looked up at him, at the face that had become so dear to her. "More than I ever thought possible." "Good." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle, "because this is just the beginning." 6 months later, on a perfect spring day with wildflowers carpeting the hills around Redemption Creek, Mabel Rivers became Mabel Xavier in a ceremony that combined Eastern elegance with Western practicality. She wore a gown of ivory silk that Mrs. Havorson had helped her sew, adorned with the silver book brooch that had been Sarah Peterson's gift. Garrett, resplendent in a new black suit, waited for her at the altar of the small church, his face alight with joy when she appeared at the door. Mayor Thompson performed the ceremony, beaming with satisfaction at what he privately considered his greatest mayoral achievement, securing not just a schoolteacher, but a love story that had transformed their town. Peterson, fully recovered from his injuries, sat in the front pew with his wife and daughter, his grudging respect for Mabel having grown into genuine admiration. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the mayor declared, and as Garrett kissed his bride, the church erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with dancing and feasting and more than a few emotional toasts to the couple that had defied superstition and found love against the odds. As the evening stars appeared, Garrett led Mabel away from the festivities and toward the waiting buggy that would take them to their new home, a sturdy 2-story house he had built on his ranch. with wide windows to catch the mountain light and bookshelves in every room for Mabel's growing collection. "Ready, Mrs. Xavier?" he asked, helping her into the buggy. "Ready, Mr. Xavier," she replied, her heart full to bursting with happiness. As they drove away from the town, lanterns illuminating their path, Mabel looked back at the place that had become her home. Redemption Creek had lived up to its name, offering her not just a fresh start but a redemption she hadn't known she needed from fear, from isolation, from the belief that she was somehow marked by misfortune. Garrett's hand found hers in the darkness, warm and reassuring. "What are you thinking?" Mabel turned to him, her husband, her champion, the man who had looked past rumors and superstition to see her true self. "I'm thinking that some curses are really blessings in disguise." He smiled, lifting her hand to his lips. "Then curse me, Mabel Xavier. Curse me with your love every day for the rest of our lives." "I think that can be arranged," she replied, leaning in to seal the promise with a kiss. Behind them, the lights of Redemption Creek twinkled like earthbound stars. Ahead, the open road stretched toward home, and the future they would build together, a future where curses were nothing more than stories, and love was the only truth that mattered. 1 year later, as the first anniversary of their wedding approached, Mabel sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. Her hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly, where their first child grew stronger each day. The sound of hoofbeats announced Garrett's return from checking the herd. He dismounted with his usual fluid grace, though Mabel noted with affection the new lines of responsibility that had etched themselves around his eyes over the past year. Running the ranch while she continued to teach had been challenging for both of them, but they had found a rhythm that worked, a balance of shared duties and mutual support. "How are my two favorite people?" he asked, climbing the porch steps to kiss her. "Active," she replied with a laugh as the baby kicked. "I think we have a future cattle rustler on our hands." Garrett placed his hand beside hers, his expression softening with wonder as he felt the movement beneath. "Strong like his mother or her father," Mabel countered. They had chosen not to guess the baby's sex, preferring the surprise. He settled into the chair beside her, stretching his long legs before him. "Sarah Peterson came by the school today," he remarked. "Said to tell you she's been accepted to that teacher's college in Denver." Mabel's face lit up with pride. "Wonderful, I knew she could do it. Her father's letter of recommendation must have helped, along with yours," Garrett reminded her. "Peterson may have come around, but it was your belief in her that really made the difference." They sat in companionable silence as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared. From inside the house came the savory smell of the stew Mabel had set to simmer earlier, and the soft ticking of the grandfather clock Garrett had surprised her with at Christmas. "I've been thinking," he said after a while, "about names for the baby." "Oh," Mabel turned to look at him, curious. They had discussed various options but hadn't settled on anything definite. "If it's a boy, what about Thomas, after Peterson?" Mabel raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Peterson. The man who called me cursed in front of the entire town." "The man whose life you saved," Garrett corrected gently. "The man who admitted he was wrong and has spent the past year trying to make amends." "Seems to me that's a legacy worth honoring, the capacity to change, to grow beyond fear and prejudice." Mabel considered this, then nodded slowly. "Thomas Xavier, it has a certain ring to it," she smiled. "And if it's a girl, I thought perhaps Sarah," he suggested. "For the one person who believed in you from the start." Tears pricked at Mabel's eyes, hormones making her more emotional than usual. "I'd like that very much." Garrett reached over to take her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I've been blessed every day since you came into my life, Mabel Xavier, curse and all." "I think we both have," she replied softly. "Who would have thought that a woman they called cursed and a man haunted by his past would find such happiness together?" "I would," Garrett said with conviction. "The moment I saw you standing there on that dusty street, trying to be invisible but shining so bright I could hardly look away. I knew." "Knew what?" she asked, though she thought she knew the answer. His smile was tender in the gathering darkness. That some curses are worth bearing, if it means finding the blessing hidden within. As night settled fully over Redemption Creek, Mabel and Garrett Xavier sat hand in hand on the porch of the home they had built together, surrounded by the life they had chosen despite the whispers, despite the fears, despite the ghosts of the past that had tried to keep them apart. And in that quiet moment, under stars that had witnessed countless human dramas unfold beneath their ancient light, the curse that had never been real dissolved completely into the blessing that always had been the blessing of love freely given and bravely accepted, of a man who had said, "Then curse me too because I choose you," and meant every word.